When Wango begot her firstborn son, she knew that he would be a problem child. She prophetically named him Koigi, or one who can't keep quiet. He was the son of Wango and Wamwere, but most importantly, he was the son of the soil, the Kenyan soil. It is only Wango who knows her son better, and only she can tell us what Koigi fears. Because from what we know, he is not afraid of priests, or the police, or the president. He's not afraid to quit, or go to jail, or even go to exile. Rumor has it that the only thing that Koigi is afraid of is being afraid. I know I have already mentioned Wango twice now, or thrice if we count this one. Yes, this is Koigi's story, but what is a son without a mother? She offers a better perspective on the origins and the end of his struggles. I mean, other than Koigi, she is the only other person who has lived through Koigi's life. First through the Kenyatta era, and then through the Moi era. In fact, the third part of this series is purely dedicated to Wango and the role she and other heroines played in the struggle. Although he grew up built in a small stature, barely 6 foot tall and weighing about 70 kgs, Koigi stood against anyone and anything that was unjust. Talking about justice, I will try and give this story all the justice and tell it right. Thanks to the archives, the numerous books, and the stories Koigi Wamwere has told about himself. Often telling a biographic story is easy. One only has to follow the path trodden by the subject, from birth through the subject's major events. But it is not so with Koigi. Koigi's life story carries with it his whole family, his community, an era, actually 2 different eras, and it also carries the story of the Cold War. It is a story of suffering but without a proper happy ending. A story of resistance but without comrade support. A story of seeds of a revolution but whose flowers might not bloom in 100 years. Koigi holds a rather unique record, one that not many would like to bear or to break. He holds the record for the longest serving political detainee/prisoner in post-colonial Kenya. Yet, despite the obvious outcome that we all know of, this would have been a different story with history-changing outcomes. For instance, Koigi would have had been the president of Kenya. But he missed that chance in 1982 and again in 1990. I mean, revolutionists like Fidel Castro and Rawlings were never elected. They took power. But after missing that window, Koigi tried to get elected as the president using the right way, the democratic way. Alas, he got 7,000 votes and came a distant 10th. So herein comes the dilemma. Knowing what befell Koigi because of his firm convictions, would you knowingly, willingly, and loudly resist a status quo? Would you cause your mother to suffer untold nights in the cold, to the extent of even stripping naked for you to be had? And would you let your wife and kids live in fear and far away from you with the uncertainty of life and the certainty of death being the most intrusive thoughts? And the last question, would you fight for Kenyans, aware that after all the struggles and sacrifices, they, Kenyans, will still line up behind wealthy politicians, corrupt money, and tribal cocoons? Would you? Koigi was born wealthy, but his family had no money. His wealth was in contentment. Being raised by a traditional African family, Koigi was taught to treat people around him right, to work together, to build together. The key word here, together. A concept that would shape his ideologies. The concept of rich only occurred to Koigi when he saw the white settlers. The settlers lived in big stone and timber houses, while in Koigi's village there were only mud houses. The white settlers had trousers and shoes. In Koigi's village, everyone walked barefooted. And despite all this, he never had his parents once complain or admire the settlers' way of life. Koigi was also born at a unique time in history. In the Kenyan context, during the Mau Mau Wars and at the beginning of self-rule. As a son of the Mau Mau, he was able to live the experience firsthand. Like when he saw his uncle, Mungai, a Mau Mau fighter, being betrayed by his own father, that is Koigi's grandfather. As a young boy, the trauma of watching his uncle being killed and his body being dragged by the colonial collaborators must have ignited a small fire in Koigi that would grow into a big blaze later in his life. In the global context, Koigi was born in the Cold War era. The world then was basically divided into two. The first bloc was the communist world, led by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, China, and other pro-communist states. The second bloc was the capitalist world, led by the United States and most of the colonial powers that we know of. As the story of Koigi unfolds, you will realize that the tension between these two blocks would have a big bearing in his life. Monica Wangu Amwere and her husband would bring up all their children. They afforded them the basic necessities, including education. Koigi's father was a forest worker in Rugongo village, Bahati, a casual laborer who toiled with his sweat and tears. Koigi's mother, Wango, was a casual worker too, picking coffee at coffee farms. But when she was not picking coffee, she was in her shamba toiling to provide the food for her household. She'd also grow to become a freedom fighter, a human rights defender. She was a woman of steel. That is what hardened her back. But bringing up a revolutionist like Koigi was not easy for her. Stubbornness and resistance were early traits in Koigi. He was not easily bullied or one who complained over small inconveniences. He was intellectually talented and vocally prepared. Yet, Wango did well to manage him. Perhaps what shocked Wango most was when her 14-year-old son Koigi told her that he wanted to become a Catholic priest. Can my son be humble? She asked herself. Can he turn the other cheek? Can he walk the straight and narrow? She wondered as she watched him leave for the seminary and the start of the rest of his life. This chapter starts with an absurdity that is perhaps 99% true. Here it is. The Kenyatta who went into prison back in 1952 was not the same Kenyatta who got out in 1959. Ideologically, Kenyatta was already pro-British, kingship, capitalism. The first evidence of this is that he was naturalized by the British systems for the 17 years that he resided in Britain, between 1929 and 1946. The second evidence was one Bruce Roy Mackenzie, a Kenyan of South African descent. Remember that name, remember this face. Now, I want you to screenshot that idea and let me explain why we can't ignore the Cold War if we want this analogy to work. And I'll bring you back to Bruce in a moment. Here's a thin outline. With the Industrial Revolution during the 19th century, many people found jobs as factory workers and earned wages. The owners of the factories, however, made more money and lived far better lives than their workers. As more and more people sought employment, the more and more labor became cheap, and consequently, the factory workers became poorer, hungry, diseased, and destitute. Obviously, as victims, the poor saw the poverty being the result of capitalist exploitation. They also saw the solution was in eliminating the rich, or the owners of capital, to make everyone equal. So, capitalism had to be replaced with socialism. The idea that prosperous people should give away their property and other resources to the poor. But since it was a revolution, this was done forcibly. All people in any class other than poor were considered enemies of the people. The rich, the middle class, the well-off peasants, they were all considered enemies of socialism. The same as classes like the clergy, landowners, and anyone who was in nobility. States like the USSR used the Marxist political philosophy, which was initially an academic theory, and hoped that it would work in real life. But the effects of socialism were worse than those of capitalism. Collectivization of resources led to decline in production, famines, and general poverty. With that said, two countries emerged as the proponents of each system. America was for capitalism. USSR was for communism. So these two states became enemies. Each had to start recruiting its allies. Allies looked after each other. If you were not an ally, you were automatically an enemy. And from that point, the world was in a Cold War. The communism world practically isolated itself, building a wall that separated the East from the West. Winston Churchill called it the Iron Curtain, but we all know it as the Berlin Wall. Remember Bruce. How does he fit in this narrative, you ask? Well, let me explain again. The US and its allies wanted to keep track of what the enemy, the USSR, was up to. And so did the USSR and its allies. They wanted to know what the US was doing. So enter the age of espionage. The USA created the CIA. The UK had the MI6. The USSR had the KGB. For the UK, in the 50s and in the 60s, as it was losing African states as its colonies, it was important to make sure that the said African countries remained capitalist and did not turn to communism. So the MI6 agents were sent to gather intelligence as countries were about to get their independence. That is where Bruce Roy Mackenzie steps in. He was the MI6 agent recruited to make sure Kenyatta would be pro-capitalism. And leaders who were pro-communism, especially those associated with Russia, were sidelined. As a recruited MI6 agent by the British, he had the covert capability to influence Kenyatta in order to promote the economic welfare of Great Britain. The 50s witnessed the uprising of most indigenous people against the colonial government. Therefore, when the Kapenguria Sikhs were arrested, the British already knew that their colonial rule was coming to an end, but they needed an economic and administrative continuity even after the so-called independence. Among the Mau Mau leaders that were arrested, Kenyatta was the most westernized. And double luck for the British, he was also the most popular independence figure in Kenya. So Bruce Mackenzie worked on Kenyatta. Bruce promised Kenyatta that the British would hand over power to him. He talked down Kenyatta on establishing an egalitarian African society, but instead a capitalist kingdom. He appeased to Kenyatta's admiration for the British monarch and promised him that he would be an African king adorned with unbridled authority and with untold riches. Bruce, in return, wanted Kenyatta to work with collaborator mercenaries instead of the Mau Mau fighters. And to prepare the path, Bruce was planted by the British as the Minister for Agriculture in 1959. Kenyatta was also sternly advised to maintain Bruce as the Minister for Land and Settlement even after independence. The irony was that independence was to be about Kenyans getting their land back from their colonialists. But now Kenyatta had appointed a colonial mercenary to be in charge of agriculture and resettlement. The British plan was working. Then in 1963, after Kenya gained her independence, Kenyatta became the king, a dictator and a capitalist. Part of the indoctrination by the MI6 agents also included fighting the Cold War with anyone who thought, spoke, or tried to impose communism. This theme was also passed over to Moi. In fact, any force necessary against such people was condoned by the prefect states, United States and the UK. Hence, Kenya never really became independent. It merely Africanized the colonial administrative structures. Britain's commercial interests were safeguarded, and the new black-skinned, propertied, and entitled class replaced the white settlers. Or, like in the words of J.M. Kariuki, it was replacing Kamau for Smith, Odongo for Jones, and Kiplagat for Keith. Here are some of the things that happened within the first decade after Kenyatta became president that prove how compelled he was by the British MI6 agents. One, he denounced the Mau Mau and vowed to work with the colonialists. 2. He allocated most of the land to himself and to his loyalists, leaving most of the Kenyans landless. The Kenyattas acquired over 500,000 acres of land. 3rd, the falling out with the people who helped him. They differed with Odinga or Cheng Oneko, built at Kagia, on ideologies of land distribution and poverty eradication. Odinga and Oneko were detained. Kagia was left in poverty. 4th, the assassinations. First, Tomboya in 1969, and later, J.M. Kariuki in 1975. It was in 1968, a young Koigi who had grown idolizing Kenyatta would become increasingly aware of the transformation of his idol into a tyrant. But then all he could do was pray for him. Pray for him, literally, because Koigi was in the seminary, training to become a Catholic priest. Michael Clement Koigi. He was a student at the Mother of Apostles Seminary in Matunda, Kitale. However, Koigi's conscience couldn't adapt to the teachings of the white priests. He saw religion as a form of a tool that the oppressors used to demand submission from the oppressed. At the seminary, Koigi was taught about blessings and curses. And according to him, Africans were already damned because they are the descendants of Shem, who was biblically cast. In the seminary, Koigi was taught to obey all authority as it comes from God. But Koigi questioned how it was possible to justify colonialism and bad governance as being God-sent. At the seminary, Koigi was taught to be celibate, to only serve God and not the desires of his flesh. But then, Koigi met a girl, a young, beautiful girl who attended the same church where the seminarians practiced. Koigi was instantly smitten. Every time he saw her, his juvenile hormones shot through his body. This mutual affection led to a kiss, his first kiss, and probably something more. After that, the fire of priesthood in his spirit was dimmed. In Koigi's words, the flame of priesthood died when hers shone. Koigi's rebellion would be birthed at this point. So in 1968, he quit the seminary. The next chapter of Koigi's young life would start in 1971 when he flew to the United States for further studies. He was studying hotel administration at Cornell University. America's purpose in Koigi's life was to give him a broader perspective on issues, especially those to do with human rights. While there, he joined African Students Association, an organization whose work was to shout out wrongs being done by governments around the world. Once in a while, he would join other comrades in Washington, D.C. to demonstrate against old colonialism, apartheid, neo-colonialism, and dictatorship. In 1971, only 2 years had passed since the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So the comrades there were rife with activism, in hope that their deeds would result in a better life for them and for their countries. Koigi, perhaps subconsciously influenced by Martin Luther King Jr., found himself daring through the same path. When Martin Luther said that he'd been to the top of the mountain and seen the promised land, he correctly predicted that he wouldn't get there. But at least he had brought his people close to it. Would the same fate befall Koigi? Koigi dropped out of university in 1973. Not that he had found a better thing to do, but because the revolutionary spirit within him was urging him to become a freedom fighter. Kenyatta was now the oppressor. He had proven that he was a capitalist dictator, looking after himself and entertaining the colonial remnants. Bruce Roy Mackenzie was still active in Kenyatta's life. Bruce represented the mercenaries that took the place that were rightfully the Mau Maus. It therefore follows that the story of Koigi and Kenyatta can't be told without mentioning more of Bruce Roy Mackenzie. Bruce was appointed as the Minister for Agriculture by Kenyatta immediately after independence. He stayed as minister for 6 good years. And within that time, he had set up systems that would ensure that Kenyatta would get all the arable land that he desired. He also trained his successor, Angaine, to continue with the land injustice system. It was Bruce who organized the August 12, 1963 meeting between Kenyatta and settlers at the Nakuru County Hall. Kenyatta decreed the famous "Forgive and Forget" call and asked the settlers to stay. Bruce was also instrumental in hiring mercenaries that did the dirty work for the government. For instance, in 1969, when Tom Mboya was assassinated, Bruce's tactics were in the traces. In 1971, when General Ndolo attempted to overthrow Mzee's government, Bruce had the intelligence to thwart the attempt in the bud. In 1975, when J.M. Kariuki was assassinated, Bruce's handiwork was again at play. In 1976, when terrorists hijacked an Israeli plane and rerouted it to Entebbe, it was Bruce who arranged for Israeli forces to set the base in Kenya. Bruce also worked closely with Patrick Shaw, a British Kenyan police reservist who was also a mercenary. Shaw was referred to as Kenya's most dreaded cop because of the way he dealt with common criminals and how he eliminated political dissidents. This was the system that Koigi was trying to oppose. Led by Kenyatta, his powerful cabinet ministers, his ruthless provincial administrators, and shadowed by the powerful British mercenaries. Koigi chose the smallest weapon of them all, the pen. As a journalist, Koigi wrote a column for the Sunday Post. His articles were stinging attacks on the injustices of the Kenyatta system. His bare-knuckle approach of punching up and beyond his weight class gained the masses' approval. But what Kenyans didn't know was that Koigi had entered into a fight that he was destined to lose. He had but just a pen. So he was like a warrior with only a spear. But he needed a shield, a helmet, and probably a breastplate. During his first year as a journalist, he visited the police cells more times than he visited his mother at Rogongo in Bahati village. Koigi felt that the best way to be better equipped was to join politics and become a member of parliament. Journalism would be his sword, politics his shield.
I came to the conclusion that there was something about journalism that wasn't quite right as a weapon of struggle. I didn't enjoy any protection as a journalist. And it was at that point that I said, I want to join politics. I want to go to parliament, become my people's representatives and speak from there with parliamentary immunity.
The 25-year-old Koigi set out to vie for the Nakuru North parliamentary seat. He was up against the Manchurian candidate of Kenyatta, Dickson Keheka Kimani. Buoyed by his excess wealth gotten from exploiting the over 30,000 peasants in his land buying company, Gwataniro Mutukanyo, Kehika would trounce Koigi in the 1974 elections. And therein, Koigi learned his first lesson in politics, a lesson that would repeat itself time and time again. The sad truth that Kenyans are happy slaves. They will line up behind negative ethnicity, corrupt money, tribal cocoons during the elections. One particular writer said that while Koigi might have had good intentions, his weakness was that he came from a community that worships money and will not support him, knowing that as they do, he is not a bourgeois, even a petty one. They will not give him the support that they would give a multi-millionaire. Out of active politics, Koigi continued with his journalism and activism. Some of the major issues he was agitating for were: one, the welfare of forest workers. He felt that retired forest workers, like his father, should be given pension just like their British counterparts. And two, resettlement of former Mau Mau veterans. It so happened that in Nakuru, more than 40,000 peasants had formed a company to buy land and resettle their families. Nakuru District Ex-Freedom Fighters Organization, NDEFFO, NDEFO. However, the directors had misappropriated the fund, condemning the peasants to desperation and poverty. Koigi's activism for NDEFO would garner him more admirers. He was becoming a man of the people. But this only worsened the police harassment against him. He was slowly attracting the attention of the top brass around Kenyatta. But Koigi was not alone in condemning the injustices at NDEFO. Another high-profile individual whose voice was increasingly radical was one Josiah Modenge Kariuki. Folks just called him Jeph. In 1974, Jeph was 45. He was an actual Mau Mau fighter. He had been detained and persecuted for 7 years by the British for this cause. He was, however, able to endear himself to Kenyatta in 1960. He became Kenyatta's private secretary for 6 years, 1963 to 1969. During that time, he was able to rub off the stardust of Kenyatta and his regime, amassing land, accumulating wealth, and gaining popular influence. He was a former Mau Mau who had turned into what he loathed, an Africanized colonialist. But one day in early 1970, he had an awakening and realized who he really was. And immediately, he started speaking against Kenyatta's governmental policies and their results, including high levels of government corruption and widening inequalities. He coined the famous phrase, "We do not want a Kenya of 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars." JM became so popular that in 1974, he won the Nyandarua parliamentary seat, having only campaigned once. Yeah, Kenyatta's government had banned all his campaign rallies. JM became a mentor to the 25-year-old Koigi. But there was a major difference between Koigi and JM. Despite them both preaching the same gospel, Koigi was seen as a small nuisance that could be dealt with by the provincial administration. On the other hand, JM was known nationally, in some places more popular than Kenyatta. And that was a political risk that Kenyatta and his cronies were not willing to take. In 1975, the mercenaries around Kenyatta knew what to do with JM. And knowing what to do, they did it on 2nd March 1975. There is a comprehensive coverage of how JM Kariuki was murdered, complete with the names and places of all those involved, from Bruce Mackenzie, who tapped his home telephone, to Patrick Shaw, who followed him, to Ben Gethy, who lured him, and to even the guys who shot him. Keep watching, as this is coming soon, or check if the link is now in the description. After JM's murder and the aftermath, Koigi's life would be altered forever. It was claimed then that JM was Kenya's version of Martin Luther King Jr. It was in reference to his martyrdom. Methinks that title would best befit Koigi Wawamwere, as this was the start of his long journey to martyrdom while still alive. To calm the masses, after the assassination of JM, the government formed a commission to investigate his murder. The vice chair of the commission was one of JM's closest allies, but also the Nakuru town MP, Mark Mwithaga. By extension, he was also Koigi's close friend. The commission unearthed a lot of evidence and mentioned powerful people within Kenyatta's government. Mwithaga was more vocal about all this than all other commissioners, attracting the wrath of Kenyatta. In a bid to protect the culprits, the government planned to silence Mark Mwithaga, jail him. But jailing Mwithaga would force him to vacate his seat and potentially create an opportunity for Koigi to replace him. The government couldn't risk that scenario either. So it was decided that both Koigi and Mark should be jailed. Without charges that could hold water in a court of law, it was found easier to detain Koigi. And so in September 1975, Koigi was detained at Kamiti Maximum Prison, inmate number 7/75. But Koigi was not the first political detainee by Kenyatta. In 1966, the government pushed for the Preservation of Public Security Act in the Constitution. It was a clause that gave the executive virtually all power to maintain public security, and it included the provision for detention without trial or explanation. Scholars argue that the 1966 laws of detention by Kenyatta were reproduced word for word like those in practice for detention, sedition, and treason between 1951 and 1961 by the British. Was Kenyatta reproducing the colonial culture in independence Kenya? I think, and I stand to be corrected, that Ochola Mark Anyengo was the first Kenyatta detainee in 1966. First from 66 to 68, and then from 69 to 74. Other prominent detainees were Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who was detained in his house for 2 years. Another detainee was Achieng' Oneko. The sadness of Achieng' Oneko's detention is that he was detained by his friend and comrade. See, Oneko was part of the Kapenguria Six back in 1952, where he and others and Kenyatta were detained. Then, 1969, post-independent Kenya, Kenyatta would detain his friend. The silver lining in Oneko's detention was that he was still in detention when KOIGI got there in 1975. KOIGI therefore was able to meet one of his heroes and share detention. During that time, KOIGI would learn a lot from Oneko and confirm his convictions for the liberation that he was fighting for. Another detainee was Wasonga Sijeo. Wasonga held the record for the longest detention under Kenyatta, 9 years. What is surprising is he had only been an MP for Game for 3 months before he was detained. What could he have said or done to offend Kenyatta that much that he'd admonish him to such punishment? Me thinks he was probably forgotten while in detention. Then there was Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He was detained in 1977 for his play Gahika Deda. He had theatrically reenacted what Kenyatta's government was doing to its people. Others were Ochola Achola, Mahat Kuno Roble, Gikonyo wa Rokongo, George Anyona, Martin Shikuku, Jean-Marie Seroney, amongst many others that I have not mentioned. KOIGI and the other political detainees were treated worse than convicted criminals. Whereas criminals were jailed as a restitution for their crimes, detainees were seen as a cancer that needed to be stopped from spreading. In KOIGI's words, the Kenyatta's dictatorship viewed ideas of freedom and justice as contagion, as insanity. I was in a cage to stop those ideas from infecting people. Detention was designed to break a man. Those who tried to fight with the walls of their cages were broken and driven to insanity. The conditions were terrible. The food was horrible, and the punishments cruel. The isolation in a cell for 22 out of 24 hours made many a man fight with his countless demons. The outer walls were so high that the whole compound was surrounded by shadows. One of the detainees, Ochola Achola, would eventually be broken by the system. He ran mad, and soon he was eating soap, insects, and anything he could collect in his cell. But the 2 hours that the detainees were allowed to interact They made good use of it with discussions. Koigi discussed Kikuyu proverbs, riddles, and songs with his friends Dairo Wamudhiga and Gishero Wanjao. Wasonga Sijeo was an expert on discussing politics and imperialist struggles. Ikonyo Warukongo was the religious connection leading the detainees in Catholic rituals. Simba Ogengiwere knew some Rumba and Lingala songs which he taught the detainees and added some Zahirian words. Mohoro wa Mutoga, known to the others as Fujika, together with Adamu Matenge and Koigi, reminisced about Nakuru, the hometown. Gishero Wanjao and Tairo Wamudhanga had heated debates on their favorite pet subject, women. Koigi also met some menacing characters like the Kikuyu contractors who were paid to kill JM Kariuki. They had been thrown into detention for demanding more money than their clients were willing to pay. The two were loathed by other political detainees. The detainees also discussed about business, with probably the only millionaire detainee, Mahat Kuno Roble, teaching them about the tricks and intricacies of business. Gogi Wadiongo, on the other hand, discussed his play, the Hikadeda, and encouraged the detainees to write them memos on whatever paper they got, including tissue paper. Gogi even wrote the manuscript of one of his novels at that time, The Devil on the Cross. So Koigi took Gogi's advice, and to stay sane, he started writing poetry, like this one. Africa, I want you to spit upon your chest and say of me, I bless thee, worthy and true son of mine. It would pain me if you were to say to me, may the breasts that sucked thee curse you, unworthy son. While in detention, Koigi and other detainees did not know what was happening in the country. They didn't have track of time. It was one long night. So Koigi did not know when one of the men who had indirectly affected his life died. In May 1978, Bruce Roy Mackenzie was killed by a bomb planted in his aircraft. Remember, back in 1976, he had assisted the Israeli government raid Entebbe and defeat Idi Amin and his troops. Well, Idi Amin retaliated. When Bruce visited Uganda, he planted a bomb in his aircraft. He had Bruce eliminated. Then, a few months later, another prominent death happened. 22nd of August 1978. Again, Koigi and the other detainees didn't know. Although Koigi admitted that he secretly prayed for Kenyatta to die, it is safe to say that it wasn't his prayers that had caused the head of state to die. It was not until December 12, 1978, during Jamhuri Day celebrations, that all political detainees were released by the then new president. Koigi was finally free. These were his thoughts as he walked out of Kamiti. When Kenyatta was in detention, I prayed for his life and freedom. Now, his death meant my freedom. He couldn't help but scribble on the concrete wall of his cell. Koigi was here. But in retrospect, what he should have written was, I will be back. Thanks for watching episode 1. Keep watching for episode 2 and 3. I'm yours, Jeph Kafka.